which is to do with language learning and learning Uzbek in post-Soviet times, and to what extent this might be affecting Uzbek language decolonization, particularly at an emotional level. So, Kamil, we look forward to your presentation. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Don. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so my home country, Uzbekistan, is located in Central Asia. It's a former Russian colony. However, when Russian Empire invaded Central Asia in the 1860s, there was no such country as Uzbekistan. My country, with its current name and within current borders, is the result of the USSR's nativization politics: one ethnicity, one republic, one language. The Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic was founded in 1924 and gained its independence in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR. Uzbek is the only state language in Uzbekistan since 1989. Today, after more than 30 years of independence, the position of Russian as the former imperial language in Uzbek society has weakened, primarily because of a lot of Russian speakers have left the country. Nevertheless, Uzbek language could not become the language of modernization in Uzbekistan. Standardized in 1956, it reflected the time and served for the next 20-30 years quite well. However, after that, and also during the period of independence, there was no governmental support to finance the Uzbek language-related research, which resulted in no modern Uzbek language suitable for the later phases of the digital age. Hence, Uzbek could not fully replace Russian from such spheres as science, politics, and economy. Still remaining the language of Uzbek elite and intelligentsia, Russian retains its dominance over Uzbek, which was historically achieved first through associating knowing only Uzbek with underdevelopment. Second, through avoiding constant inferiority or awkwardness and disesteem related to Uzbek language. And the third one is, of course, killing the knowledge system, so-called epistemicide. At the same time, some systems, for example, teaching and learning Uzbek as a second language, did not exist before Russians came to Central Asia. The first teachers of Uzbek as a second language were not Uzbek, but Russian people. Moreover, Uzbek language was introduced as a subject in local schools only in the 1930s, so during Soviet time. In fact, the system of teaching Uzbek as a second language introduced by Russians was not bad for its time. However, as the position of Russian in colonial Uzbekistan got stronger, the desire of Russian settlers to learn Uzbek became weaker. According to the statistics, in 1989, a few years before dissolution of the USSR, less than 0.5% of 18% ethnic Russians who lived in Soviet Uzbekistan could speak Uzbek. Independence did not change the situation much. Ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking minorities still remain reluctant or struggle to learn Uzbek. Moreover, the colonial past and continuous hidden colonialism caused a certain percent of the Russian-speaking ethnic Uzbeks to struggle learning their heritage language, or even to treat it as unneeded. Continuous political and economic influence of Russia on Uzbekistan is so tempting to explain this situation. However, aren't there any other reasons? Could it be, for instance, because of the emotions that Russian speakers experience when they study Uzbek as a state language at school? As an ethnic Uzbek person whose first language is Russian, but who nevertheless could learn Uzbek, whereas my siblings and a lot of friends, colleagues, and classmates couldn't, I found this area very interesting to explore. Drawing all threads on decolonization, language, emotion, and education, I formulated my today's presentation as experiences of learning Uzbek as a second language in post-Soviet Uzbekistan, affecting the extent of Uzbek language decolonization at the emotional level. Speaking about the conceptual framework I chose for my research, it was developed by Mikalina Zembelas. He argues that decolonization will happen more effectively if started at emotional micro level, because coloniality is something very deep, usually overgeneralized, only demonized, and often becomes just an empty talk. According to Zembelas, decolonization at emotional level takes 3 stages. First is feeling discomfort with the continuous colonial struggles. Second is feeling decolonizing solidarity, so-called standing with, nurtured by decolonial pedagogies. And third is constantly practicing the emotional work, aiming at identifying and rearranging colonial logic in a daily life, but not from the position of the privilege. All this should result in reinventing the relationships of the formal colonizer with indigenous people. I found this framework very appropriate for my initial plan, which was about interviewing holders of colonial legacy, namely the people of non-Uzbek ethnic origin, to understand what prevented them from learning Uzbek. However, I was struck with the fact that there is no logic to try getting insights about Uzbek language-related colonial struggles from Russian settlers. This question made me think of Zembales's framework as something addressing only the former colonizers. His notion of standing with is addressed only to the former colonizers. What about standing within? In other words, is it assumed that the indigenous people are all united in terms of decolonizing solidarity? To check this assumption, I changed my initial plan and decided to include more interviews with ethnic Uzbeks about their struggles and successes to learn Uzbek as a second language in family, school, university, and interacting with the wider environment, which became the basis for the narrative inquiries. Most of my participants said that the role of family and interactions with the wider environment were the most positive in terms of learning Uzbek, whereas their school and university experiences were generally not good. People of non-Uzbek origin could learn Uzbek only if they lived in an Uzbek neighborhood, where the need to socialize and interact with neighbors fostered the development of Uzbek skills. Similarly, ethnic Uzbeks who lived in a Russophone environment were often discouraged to learn Uzbek and hence lacked fluency in it. The inability to learn Uzbek, taught for years at school and university, was admitted by most of my interviewees as something discomforting and shameful. However, it was not their entire fault. Being impractical, this learning was not only boring, but at times very humiliating and traumatic, killing any desire to learn Uzbek. Notably, it is not only schools, but in some cases families that humiliated their kids for their wrong pronunciation, inability to speak or understand Uzbek, which became a barrier for them to improve it. Additionally, the Uzbek-speaking environment seems to be very selective, meaning that it favors ethnic Uzbeks to learn Uzbek, but does not do so for their compatriots of non-Uzbek origin. This selectivity, as well as the above-mentioned humiliation, does not seem to improve the relationship of the former colonizers and the colonized, and it does not encourage the former colonizers to engage with the continuous colonial struggles of indigenous people. Logically, such a relationship building is possible at presence of common language at the level of enabling the dialogue between both parties. This means that decolonizing Uzbek language now seems impossible without learning its current semi-colonial, outdated form well, which itself is a paradox. Speaking of decolonizing solidarity, it's worth mentioning that very few interviewers were familiar with the concept of decolonization or expressed thoughts that could be characterized as decolonial. Those who did that studied or worked in countries with a strong decolonizing agenda. Thus, it can be suggested decolonization ideas seem to permeate Uzbek society mainly from outside. Most of the interviewees did not see any colonial influence of Russian on Uzbek and said that it was rather positive. I have also interviewed the teachers of Uzbek as a second language, and none of them knew anything about decolonization, decolonial pedagogies, which can explain why people might feel discomfort about their struggles to learn Uzbek, but do not feel decolonizing solidarity. It is simply not nurtured at school. And if it's not taught, there is nothing to practice. Thus, applying Zembales's theory on Uzbek language decolonization, it can be suggested that it seems that this conceptual framework keeps in mind only the settlers, colonizers. They should feel discomfort. They should demonstrate decolonizing solidarity. They should stand with the indigenous people. There seems to be an assumption that there is decolonizing solidarity among or within indigenous people. However, this is a big assumption. The interviews conducted suggest that there is no such solidarity among ethnic Uzbeks. The ideas of decolonization permeate the Uzbek society from outside. Uzbek society itself does not generate them. Out of the research participants, only those who worked or studied in countries with a strong decolonizing agenda, like Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Baltic countries, are more cognizant of the importance of respecting their state language nationwide. My presentation is over. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamil. Well done within the time, and we certainly have some time for questions. So I'd be happy to take questions from the floor. I think that your presentation was really, really interesting and certainly relates to some of the discussion that came up at the last event, which was concerned with the role of language and its impact and its effects upon understanding and collaboration, etc. And I think that what you've presented is a very, very interesting and detailed picture of what is happening within your own country and context in that respect. So thank you very much for that. Very, very interesting presentation. So I don't see any, I do see a hand up, but I don't know, Carmen, whether you have any comments or questions before Richard would like to ask a question.
We just have a comment from Matrice, thank you, saying, Kamil, language and culture are so intertwined. Your work is meaningful and powerful. Thank you for your increasing my learning today. Okay.
Thank you very much for your comment and encouragement. Thank you.
Okay, so Richard, you have your hand up. We have time for a question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, Kamil. It's really interesting to see this project really kind of, I remember talking to you about this, quite a long time ago and seeing how it's coming around or coming along. Super interesting. You mentioned that the participants didn't really recognize decolonization as a thing, in a sense. Is there potentially a distinction between them recognizing things as decolonial and us recognizing things that might be decolonial? So, for example, were they entirely positive about the Soviet occupation and the impact, or were there also elements that they might recognize, even if they don't identify them explicitly as decolonization?
Well, I would say that the majority of my research participants didn't really accentualize any negativity about the Soviet past. I mean, there were only 2 or maybe 3 that started thinking of it in a different way, because they had, like one of my participants, she had a workshop in Georgia and Kazakhstan, and she learned a lot about decolonization there. So she started questioning actually the way she perceived our past, and that helped her to start developing that decolonial mindset. Otherwise, I mean, people were either not willing to talk about this in detail, or didn't express any negativity about that. So, I mean, because they didn't say much about it, I don't think that, like, I'm just thinking that if it was a real worry or a real pain, they probably would definitely say something. But because they didn't, regardless the probing, I mean, regardless how many probing questions I asked, I just feel that they either are neutral or positive about, or sometimes even nostalgic about Soviet past.
Well, that's also then interesting from a decolonizing perspective, because it appears that the minds, to some extent, have been heavily colonized, right? As in they can't even see beyond. But yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Thanks, Kamil. Carmen?
We have a comment from Caroline saying really important and interesting work, Kamil, thank you. And then we have a question from Thomas who says, thanks for the presentation, Kamil. Can I ask if Uzbeks have their own version of Russian, as in a language they have appropriated for their own use? If so, this will potentially be an act of resistance and thus a form of decolonization.
Well, thank you very much for this question. It's actually very interesting, especially in Tashkent, the capital city of Uzbekistan. The Uzbeks mix Russian with Uzbek when they speak. And this is now considered a feature of the Tashkent dialect of Uzbek language. So yes, they do have, well, I mean, I'm not sure if it can be called a version of Russian. Maybe it's a version of Uzbek. So would it potentially be an act of resistance? It might be, because obviously, you know, in our society, we have different tendencies, and one of them is purism in language, when they try to replace Russian loan words with Uzbek one, or like Persian or Arabic ones. But again, like, you know, the problem is that many of the words that, I mean, they try to introduce, they are not accepted by society. So I believe we can talk about resistance in these terms.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Kamil. Thank you for all of the questions, and thank you so much for your presentation, Kamil. And may we all thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.